Questioning the science and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And the millennial joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer. Welcome, everyone, to this podcast. It's called Questioning the Science and the Dumbest Bill in America. And who do we have with us today? Dr. Jim Small. Welcome, Dr. Jim Small.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's good to be back again.
I'm glad you're back again, because this podcast listeners, is questioning the science, because apparently there's this thing that's called following the science versus questioning the science. Explain what that is.
Well, if you recall from the very beginning of the COVID crisis back in late 19, early 20, there was this mantra that came out that we were going to follow the science. We were going to listen to the scientists, which in of itself is a really great phrase, right? I mean, that's how we're all trained in the modernization of our lives, is to follow the science. But the very root of what science is ironically the question, and the fact that we should question things. And that's how science develops, is the fact that we have questions. In fact, most people remember some little bit of their childhood education and the concept of the scientific method. The way we look at things, the way we look at the world, the way we advance our knowledge is by forming a question, and then taking that question and coming up with a hypothesis on how we might think that question would be answered. And then we proceed to test that hypothesis by looking at data. And so when we are asked to, quote, follow the science, we really are to question the science, because science is an evolutionary growth of knowledge that is only based on the fact that you question what came before you.
You want to keep questioning things in science, to almost use the Socratic method, to keep questioning things, to ask questions about what is going on, and then follow what you're learning. Does that sound about right?
Yes, absolutely. When you look at things and take them at face value, you accept that people before you made these questions. And I think the way that things are happening so rapidly in the world today, we have succumbed to that idea of we're just going to allow someone else to phrase the question. But most of us who have a grain of common sense in our lives and think about the world in a way of a little bit of challenge, a little bit of curiosity. And I think it's in all of us that we can't help but question. We can't help but look at the things that are being told to us today, whether it's from someone like Bill Gates, who is proposing lots of ideas, or someone like Anthony Fauci, or someone as simple as a high school teacher who's presenting ideas to your student. You have to ask questions. You know, when I was a high school teacher, and I was for about 11 years, one of the greatest joys in life as a teacher was having a student question what you were saying. It did two things, really. First of all, it allowed me as a teacher to see that person's development literally happening in real time. Because when you frame a question, you are thinking on a deeper level. But by also asking me a question, it made me think. It made me analyze how I was saying things, or how I was presenting things to the students. And as a physician, you do the same thing. When you present information to a patient and they ask a question, it is a moment of epiphany, if you will. It's a moment where that person is going outside the acceptance of things at face value and beginning to look on their own and formulate their own ideas and their own concepts of understanding. And so the very basis of growth of knowledge is the question. And so when we deny the fact that there is a question, or we push down the idea that there can be another way of thinking about something, we are stifling the very existence on which we pride ourselves, which is the growth of knowledge and the growth of understanding. But it all comes down to the question.
So denying the question, I like that. So let's go down that pathway. Denying the question, here's the question that I think we all hear all the time. You're a doctor, no doubt that you hear it much more than I do. But as an elected official, I hear it a ton. And namely, why is this pandemic different? Why is this virus different in that if I get the virus and I survive and have antibodies like other viruses in the past, why is it still necessary that I get not one shot, not two shots, but ongoing shots? Can I just rely on my apparently very successful and robust antibodies moving forward? And so that is a question. Unfortunately, what we've seen since 2020, it's a question that initially people were terrified to ask because they would be laughed at or considered, heretics, burn them at the stake. And even now in 2021, it's kind of still like that a little bit because people are saying mask mandate.
Well, I think, when you look back, the ignorance of the first few months that we had, which was a worldwide ignorance, we really didn't know. And we were trying to gather information. And so that concept of trust the science was real. You were trying to trust the people who were making the questions, who were asking all of these things and trying to gather information on a worldwide platform or on a national platform. And then in turn, you're trusting that dissemination of information back to you in an accurate way. And so the concept and mantra of trust the science was something that was real. And we did honestly try to trust the science. But as time has passed, that information and that knowledge that has come out is now grown infinitely. And our ability to understand what's happening out there in the world with this virus, with the treatment options, with the side effects of this and that, and who's at risk and who's not at risk, the questions have grown. And those questions continue to be mounted out there, yet the people who are asking the questions and looking at the data and forming new hypotheses are stifled. And I see this because what we're exposed to on a daily basis, and I still am reminded of many of the news channels for months and months and months, all they put out were simple numbers of who's dying worldwide. Johns Hopkins has their database that's still going on, by the way. And you're just looking at pure numbers. Well, there's a lot of depth in those numbers. There's a lot of understanding when you dive down and you look at the individual questions. The first question that everybody asks is, am I going to die?
Absolutely.
Is this going to kill me?
Yes.
Okay. And once we realized that that was not the case, if you look at the statistics, and we began to analyze things at a greater level, and we begin to look at things with a microscope and deal with things on a finer level, then we begin to expand our understanding. And this knowledge base is available to people. I mean, you can go and look for these things. They're not handed to you. I mean, that's another thing here is science is not, it requires effort. You must input work into figuring out things. It doesn't come to you like a burning bush to Moses. You must go and find this information and dig for it. And that's the whole principle behind that concept of the scientific method. But people are doing this, and they are publishing their data in respected journals such as The Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine and countless others around the world. And this data is there. And a lot of people now are questioning things like, do we need to have booster shots? Do we need to respect natural immunity over artificial immunity created by these vaccines? What is the actual technology of the vaccines, and how does it affect the human immune system, short-term and long-term? All of these things are legitimate, and there are many people asking the questions. It's not just the scientists anymore. It's the population. It's the people are asking the questions. And it is a glorious thing when people start looking and asking in that epiphany sort of way I alluded to earlier, when they begin to think for themselves and understand things and question things, because you see that there is a lot more here than just a simple virus that started out almost 2 years ago with great fear. So I encourage people to look with greater integrity of depth and not just accept things. Accepting things is what you do in an emergency. And when we first started this 2 years ago, it was an emergency. We did not know.
It most definitely was, yes. Everybody was terrified.
Absolutely. And now everybody's had a chance to take a breath through a mask and figure out
several breaths through several layers of masks.
Yes, which is a whole nother topic. But the concept of looking at things now that we've had a chance to do it and seriously ask. And you know what? One of the great, glorious things about science is you're allowed to be wrong. And no one seems to acknowledge that we can be wrong. That's what science does. By asking the questions and looking with the greatest integrity of depth, it allows you to be wrong. And no one seems to be willing to admit that they might be wrong.
Why is that? Why is it that there are new studies that have come out that have successfully questioned the conventional wisdom about different things, different subjects relating to COVID, whether it be masks, whether it would be ivermectin or, remdesivir or ventilators. And yet it just seems like the folks at the top that are making the decisions, Fauci, states, health commissioners, whoever they may be, they're so slow to respond to this new information. What's happening? Is that more a political thing, or is it that we have an institution in America that no longer wants to question science?
Well, it could be a little bit of both, or even other things that we can't even imagine at this time. You can't help but imagine how this has become something greater than it was in the beginning. When you are rushing to develop vaccines, when you're rushing to develop technology to, quote, save the world, and you involve vast, unimaginable sums of money in this process, you can't help but imagine that there's more to this than simply the illness itself. And I think that's where a lot of people are now seriously looking at things. And can you have the science on the purest science level of medicine? Of course, but you can also have the science of politics, the science of economics, because that is all about asking questions. And so questioning a manufacturer, questioning the politics of money, questioning the politics of mandates and control is all intertwined in this. This has become vastly more than it was 2 years ago. And you're foolish if you don't amalgamate all of this together and say it is interconnected. You cannot isolate one from the other because it has grown so large and has so many moving parts and components that you're a fool to try to separate them out because they are all there.
It's interesting because the other day I was thinking about how Eisenhower, when he left as president, warned us of the military-industrial state. And now I feel like we need to be worried about the healthcare industrial state because it has become so powerful that it can tell us that we have to wear masks indoors and mandate them outdoors. And I mean, here's an example, Dr. Small. We have here in the Epic Times, a dying COVID-19 patient recovers after the court orders the hospital to administer ivermectin. So here we have a patient that's going to die from COVID-19. They're giving him other treatments like remdesivir and whatever else that they're providing, but not ivermectin. And what's interesting is I thought that the Trump administration, one of the things that they passed when you had a Republican Congress, at least, was the right to try. We did that here in Maryland, too, which is, okay, so maybe the medicine that's out there hasn't been approved for this particular use, but it's still been approved by the FDA, or maybe the medicine hasn't been approved at all by the FDA. But if you're going to die anyway, you have the right to try because you might live. Well, this patient lived as a result of receiving ivermectin, which the hospital wouldn't give them. So this goes back to, Dr. Small, the point of questioning the science. Why in the heck would a hospital not question the science? And why in the heck would a hospital not engage in the right to try?
There's probably a great deal of complexity in that. Hospitals are governed by many different components, not only the structure of the hospital, but also concern for liability. They're governed by a medical staff board. They're governed by different components and committees that make protocols and decisions in hospitals. I truly don't understand that. I've read those same stories, and it's not just one. It's actually multiple stories that have come to light.
So it's bureaucracy, maybe?
Well, I think it is. I mean, my personal opinion is that that's what it is.
Interesting.
Because, when you have a group of doctors who refuse to do something to save a life, we border on some interesting situations here. If the first rule, as we discussed in our last concept, our last podcast of the concept of informed consent, is to do no harm and then to do good, sometimes those ethical principles do interact with each other, and you can have multiple components of ethical principles overlapping. Autonomy versus beneficence versus malfeasance and justice, all these things interact. They're not in themselves isolated ethical issues. But when you have a patient who seems to have exhausted all opportunity to live, in a sense, and you're down to a 10% chance, and you have something that potentially can make a difference, and the family wants it. In fact, the family's gone to court in these cases and sought a judge's intervention to force the hospital to give it. We've crossed into a new realm of understanding of what is really driving this. And when you look across the country, different states are managing things differently, different communities are managing things differently. And that's just part of the vast expanse of the United States. However, if no one goes in and says, there's a problem here, then we are guilty of continuing down the same path.
What if the patient's spouse, in this particular case, you have a patient that has a 10% chance of dying, and the spouse says, give him ivermectin. And the doctor in the hospital or the hospital itself says no. Wouldn't the right thing to ask then is, look, what is the informed consent? Give me the informed consent. Inform me about what could possibly go wrong by providing ivermectin. And my sense is that informed consent isn't even happening in those cases. It's just like, no, that's our policy. We're just not going to do it. But meanwhile, aren't there like publications out there concerning ivermectin's use in Africa, in the continent of Africa, or in India? Or is that hydroxychloroquine? I'm not really sure. But my point is, it's being used.
Well, ivermectin is being used around the world, and it's being used successfully even in the United States. And
For COVID.
I mean, primarily it's used as an antiparasitical, and that's its primary function. But early on in this process in 2020, they discovered that ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and some other medications have potential benefit. And there was a lot of effort to begin to do studies. And in fact, some studies were done. And they've all proven to be very promising, if not positive, in the long-term effects of curing or allowing surviving of a patient, or survivability of a patient. So when you look at the cumulative knowledge that's been gathered around the world, these medications that were discounted initially, oh, no, we can't do that. No, we have to focus on vaccines. And then it took all that time to get the vaccines, even though it happened very quickly. It took 8, 9, 10 months to get those vaccines out. There were a lot of people who weren't treated because there was no treatment. We were doing steroids. We were doing antibiotics to try to save someone from getting pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia. We were trying to treat with everything, including the ventilators and so forth, and we were not being very successful at it. Our previous conversations have highlighted some of those things. But the concept behind why we are not questioning the success of these things, when we're looking at the studies that are now, time has passed, where you can have legitimate, large numerical studies which looked at comparing one drug against a placebo or one drug against another drug, things that take time to accumulate the knowledge are coming out. And they're coming out in favor that these things do make a positive difference. And then you have all the anecdotal evidence, like the newspaper article you just mentioned, and I've seen several of those. And I have known people personally who have been more speedily healed or more rapidly recovered from COVID using ivermectin.
Yet it's been pulled from many pharmacies.
Well, it has, and that's another conversation about pharmacists and their role and whether or not they have the authority to say, well, I'm not going to give this patient that medicine, even though you as a physician have prescribed that. We have entered into completely uncharted territory on many of these levels. But the fact is that when people question, and there are many people who've questioned, there are many protocols out there that use ivermectin, that use hydroxychloroquine, that are valid protocols that are in the process of being tested and that have worked. And there are entire countries, entire states around the world that have used ivermectin and have used those protocols to successfully tamp down the COVID in their countries. India, El Salvador, a lot of these poor countries. And then I read a statistic the other day that Africa has 17% of the world's population, but only 3% of the COVID cases. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? If this thing is worldwide, why isn't it affecting Africa? Well, you could argue, well, maybe they don't keep the statistics that we do. Well, I don't think that's necessarily the case because the World Health Organization is keeping track of these things like a fine-tooth comb. But you know what's the one thing that they use endemically in Africa is antiparasitical medications because of all of the various parasites and worms and so forth that people encounter living on the land and in poor, undeveloped, societies that don't have good sanitation and so forth. And one can't help but go, well, that's an interesting question. If you were a high school student in high school biology and you said, I have a question. And that question is based on something I just read about, that Africa has some of the lowest population rates of COVID in the world, yet it has almost a fifth of the world's population as a continent. What could that be? Could it be the fact that they use antiparasiticals? I have a hypothesis. Hypothesis is antiparasiticals do reduce the incidence of COVID. I'm going to do an experiment. Bada bing, bada boom, and there we go. There's our scientific method. There's our science fair project, so to speak, that every high school and middle school student had to do at some point in their life to develop that hypothesis based on some information, develop a plan, an experiment, and so forth. And there again, we go back to the question, and no one is looking at the fact that all these things are being done. We're not talking about it, and we should. It is just beyond my understanding why we're not seeing things because we have access to all of this.
And why is it that, let's say, we don't have a compare and contrast between the negative impacts of taking, is it indeed hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin that's being used in Africa? Or is it both?
Well, it's both, really.
Okay. So why is it that we don't have this compare and contrast by questioning the science between the continent of Africa that has focused on ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine to also fight the pandemic versus, and what have been the negative reactions to taking those medicines versus taking Pfizer or Moderna shots or Johnson & Johnson, and what has been the compare and contrast between the negative impacts of taking shots there. So in other words, you have two kinds of medicines. You have shots in the US, and you have, what they're calling vaccines, which are nonsense, not a vaccine, in my opinion. And I'm not a doctor, I know. That's why we have Dr. Small here, podcast listeners. But on the one hand, in the US, we have shots. And on the other hand, they're just taking medicine orally, correct?
Yes.
In Africa. And so
And other countries too.
in other countries, since my question is, why aren't we questioning the science, like comparing and contrasting how many people are getting seriously ill from the shots and or dropping dead versus how many people are seriously getting ill or dropping dead from taking oral medication in the continent of Africa? And then when you question that science, you can come to some sort of conclusion as maybe there's a better path to go down.
Well, I think a lot of that's been squelched. And it goes back to what I said earlier, that this thing has become so large and the politics so huge that you cannot separate the two. There's an understanding that there is a lot of money here. And the need to continue down this path is enormous. But I also read something the other day that intrigued me, because it was also something that made me go, that's an interesting question. There's been a push that some of the large vaccine manufacturers have not gone into the poorer countries. And it's not really because they're not going to get paid. It's because some of these countries have not given them a release of liability.
Interesting.
And I read that and I thought, well, I don't know the politics of all the countries in the world, but I can see that being a concern, because we've also discussed on previous podcasts this concept of liability and how vaccine manufacturers in the United States have a blanket immunity against forms of liability from harm that can come from vaccines. And so when you can't escape the fact that many studies show that the boosters may not be doing anything, but we don't know because the boosters have only been used in a certain group of population. But even the most savvy civilian, if you will, can't help but see that there is an intertanglement between the politics of money and the politics of science here. You cannot escape that, because it is obvious that
here's, and I want you to stay on this track. This is really important for me and for the podcast listeners, because this track of money corrupting science, and that you can't sue Pfizer when you have a negative reaction to the vaccine, particularly one that is potentially fatal or, makes you very sick. Just a story real quick. A colleague of mine, someone I serve with, I'm not going to mention any names, decided for whatever reason to get the vaccine recently, and found themselves incredibly sick. He said his wife was taking his temperature and he had 106-degree temperature. He said he was so incredibly ill. He said, literally, I thought I was going to die from this vaccine. He said, and I want to make this really clear to big tech out there, because there is a connection with this particular individual and the vaccine, without question. Got the vaccine, then got deathly ill, and decided to suck it up and work his way through it because he's in very good shape and takes care of himself. Felt like he had worked his way through it, got past the fever and the generalist feeling like he was going to die, but then found himself having to go to the hospital anyway a couple days later because he had terrible pains in his side. Gets to the hospital, and they're like, well, we think that you probably have a blood clot. And he's like, well, I'm in the prime of my life. I just don't get sick like this. I just had this vaccine. The hospital's like, yeah, well, okay, whatever, come here because we think you might have a blood clot. And it's like, okay, well, it's not just whatever. It's like, give me some information, because I'm questioning the science a lot right now because I feel like I'm going to die and I want to sue somebody right now because I'm being told by the government and by employers I need to get this thing. And then I get it. I'm putting my life on the line. In this particular case, not all cases, podcast listeners and big tech, God knows we don't want you to cancel us, but with this particular individual, and all he's saying is where do I go to fix this problem? And moving forward, how do I stop others from having the same problem? And I think it's because no one wants to question the science. Go ahead.
Well, that's a very sad case. we've all known many people who've received the vaccine and been fine. Maybe some mild symptoms. And we, of course, most of us know people who have not received the vaccine, and that's choice. And the understanding here is really...
Although it's not choice if you're being told you're going to be fired if you don't get the vaccine.
Well, in its fundamental level, it is choice. And the choice, sadly, forces many people to pick their job versus the vaccine, or pick, whether or not they're going to be able to, attend an event versus a vaccine, or go on a vacation versus a vaccine. And someone, I read something on social media the other day that used that sort of concept, that the questions people ask themselves about the vaccine, ironically, have nothing to do with their health. Do I want to attend this concert? Oh, I need a vaccine. Do I want to go on a vacation? Oh, I need this vaccine. Do I want to go in this grocery store? Oh, I need this vaccine. Do I want to have a job? I need this vaccine. So the question is, are you really getting the vaccine for your health, or are you getting the vaccine because of some other governmental control? And so that's really a very valid question in my mind, because many, many people I know have chosen the vaccine for one of those reasons I just mentioned, and not because of their health, which is counterintuitive to the whole concept. And it just, again, one question begets another question, begets another question. You start to sound, like some book of the Old Testament, where you go through all the generations of begat, because each question leads to another question. And that's where we find ourselves today. There are people asking themselves lots and lots of questions, but this is good.
Finally.
This is finally good.
Yes.
Because people are waking up and asking themselves very important things. You mentioned masks earlier.
Yes.
And the whole concept of mask mandates. And people are asking themselves these questions. When I lived in Japan, when I was in the military, and we lived outside of Tokyo, and we go downtown in Tokyo, I'd probably say 20% of the population wore a mask. They wore the blue surgical masks that are sort of ubiquitous these days. And you would see them, people on buses, people in the streets, people on subways. And it was just part of the accepted population of whatever. I don't know why those people chose to wear masks, but it was part of the society. Mm-hmm. Where in the United States, that was not the case, right? No one wore masks before 2 years ago. We shook hands with people. We touched people. We opened doors and we hugged people. I mean, it's part of our society. But in Japan, they're bowing and they're wearing masks. It's just a different culture. And then we were told that initially there were no need to wear masks. Masks don't do anything to protect us. In fact, they're rather nasty things because they get covered with, secretions and so forth. And over the end of the day, they're just full of germs and dust, and people are touching them with their hands. And I've seen countless videos of Dr. Fauci himself discounting the need for masks. And then all of a sudden we started wearing masks, and then we didn't have enough masks. So now we're making masks, and then we're putting cloth masks on top of paper masks, and we're taking masks and putting them in ovens to sanitize them, to reuse them the next day. And this vast concept of trying to recycle and protect ourselves with these masks. And
then we told the vaccinated they have to wear masks.
Well, that's right. And it's, again, it goes down.
So then when I question the science that's when I started questioning the science.
You stop. You cannot question. You cannot ask the question, because someone else has already asked that question and they have told you the answer.
Yes.
But,
Dr. Fauci, I am the science.
Well, yes. And we saw that, yes, most recently here a few weeks ago. And that to me is the antithesis of science. When you say, I am science, well, that's just foolishness. It
Exactly.
makes no sense whatsoever. And when someone gets that important and full of themselves, we have crossed into some new realm of absurdity. And I think that's where we've gotten on a lot of these things. It's
Absolutely.
Just absurd. People wearing masks in their car while they're driving by themselves. People walking down the street with their child holding their hand, and they as an adult are not wearing a mask.
But the 5-year-old is.
But the 5-year-old's wearing a mask, and there's not a person within 100 yards. And these types of things, yet they'll go to concerts and football games, and there'll be tens of thousands of people cheering that are literally shoulder and elbow to elbow. And we're not creating mass, explosions of disease. This is a virus that does have serious consequences for some people. There are some people who do have medical issues where even a cold can be risky to them. So yes, it needs to be taken seriously. However, when you look at the statistics, which we talked about when we discussed informed consent, that's all we can look at. We can look at the data. We can look at the science, ironically. We can look at the statistics. Most everyone is going to be fine. And we have mechanisms to treat them. We don't need to be in fear. Fear is really part of this. We've skimmed around it a lot. We talked about the politics. We've talked about money. But what we haven't talked about is the elephant in the room, and that is fear.
Which in part, I think, has been promulgated by those who say, I am the science, or this is settled science, or this is just the way it's going to be, because look at the science. And then, as you said, then you see all this crazy stuff going on, like leaders going to parties and not wearing masks, even though they're putting in mandates, or the mom with the kid, as you said before, she's not wearing a mask. He is, they're outside.
Or duplicitous politicians who, on one hand, tout all of this stuff and then go and do things privately with their family, ignoring the very rules that they mandated on the population. And these types of things are causing people to ask the questions. They're causing people to see the error, to see the mistakes, to see the concepts maybe don't have the truth that everyone is saying they do.
But wouldn't you agree that there is a certain percentage of our population that has been so fear-driven that they no longer question the science themselves? They just drink in whatever they're told. And therefore decide they're going to just live in fear and are okay with wearing a mask for the rest of their lives and getting, hundreds of boosters between now and 20 years from now, because they're told that's what they have to do, and never actually question anything anymore. And I think that's what scares me about this. It's what scares me, how the science has been corrupted and politicized. And of course, it hasn't helped, naturally, podcast listeners with the media, which is basically saying things, about the various other treatment options as well.
Well, fear is sensationalism, and fear is what allows people to have that adrenaline rush, that fight or flight syndrome. Fear creates the good movie that people want to go see, where they have a little bit of fear, that climax of the movie. Fear is what allows people to, have that excitement on a roller coaster at an amusement park. So our society always operates on a little mild dose of fear. Why do we want the faster car? Why do we want the taller buildings? Why do we want all these things that elicit just a little touch of fear? So people like a little touch of fear. And so fear is very manipulative. And when you can take fear and couple it with your life, then perhaps you have control over somebody in the ultimate sense of the word. And so fear wrapped up in the package called COVID, wrapped up in a larger package called politics and control, has brought us to the state that we're in now, where we have these things that are preposterous things that we would have never in our wildest dreams imagined to exist. In fact, we would argue the contrary even a year or two ago. And this is where we find ourselves today, when you have court cases coming out saying, whoa, 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 whoa. Now, you can't do that as a president of the United States. You can't mandate that everybody in companies over 100 employees have to get the vaccine. And then when you think, well, if the president can't do it, well, how can the mayor of New York City do it? How can the Los Angeles Department of Education do it? This thing is...
And why does a 5-year-old need a vaccine? I mean, for this, I'm talking about.
Well, that's right. And I will tell you.
And I want to make clear for the podcast listeners, I'm not saying why does a 5-year-old not need any vaccine. I'm not saying that. I'm saying why this vaccine? Why is it so important? What is the emergency for the 5-year-old? Because, when I question the science, I can't get answers.
Well, when you stick with the specifics of this issue, which is COVID and the exposure to COVID and the fact that when will it ever end? And I'm reading more and more saying that COVID is becoming very much like the flu and the cold. It just is a thing that's going to be part of our life. It's going to be every year, every day. It's just going to be background noise in our life.
Absolutely.
And so managing it's a boondoggle for the vaccine manufacturers. I mean, it's like when you go to Best Buy and purchase a printer and realize that $30 printer that you think is the best thing since sliced bread has now committed you to the purchase of $120 worth of printer cartridges every 3 months. Because this is
We have one of those in our office, don't we, Chris? Yeah.
This is something that will not end until people say, okay, this is enough.
I'm going to question this and I'm going to make corrections. Well, we're going to have some fun podcast listeners with Dr. Jim Small now, because we have a go woke or go broke. That's right. We have a go woke or go broke, and it's right down Dr. Small's alley of medicine. Namely, we have a trans swimmer who has crushed the women's records. So there's a trans swimmer. This is all through the media, but this is from Breitbart, who crushes women's records, likely to win the NCAA titles. So transgender Penn swimmer Leah Thomas, a biological male, has been crushing women's records and will likely take home the title at the NCAA championships in March. Well, this particular swimmer, podcast listeners, has not just broken the record, but just crushed the record in college swimming. And of course, you have to ask yourself the question, well, how is that possible? It's a dude who's swimming in women's competition. So we have a quick clip from Tucker Carlson talking about this matter. It's worth listening to. Here it is.
At the University of Pennsylvania, a biological man has decided to say that he's a woman, he's a swimmer, and he's destroyed the women's swimming records, of course, because he's a man, actually. The swimmer goes by the name of Leah Thomas, competed for 3 years as a man before he decided to identify as a woman. And in a recent women's competition, he just won a 500-yard freestyle by a full 14 seconds. Now, if you swim or ever do a swim meet, 14 seconds? That's time enough to get a beer and come back. Like that, there's no 14-second differences between swimmers, but there are now. Thomas's closest rival in a longer freestyle race was 38 seconds behind. That's a different country.
So we just had Christopher Hopkins, our producer, say, I wonder how he did when he was competing against men, I mean, did he break the record then? And is that when he made his decision? So we're going to settle science because this podcast is questioning science. And we have this go woke or go broke where a dude is crushing women's swimming records and is probably going to hold the new NCAA title. And so I'm just curious if the man is really a woman and Dr. Small here is an OBGYN. Have you ever seen a man give birth in the hospital when you're on call?
No,
it hasn't happened. Okay. That's interesting. I'm shocked. I'm shocked that hasn't happened yet. Because I feel like, at least the dude has to be able to do that. Then I have another question too. And that is, does he wear, cause I guess he does, he wears the woman's one piece, cause guys, when they go swimming, they wear the Speedo thing, right? Which, is humiliating enough, for most people. But if you're a woman, they get to wear the one piece. But the one piece, when you can picture it, it comes down very, very closely and tightly in the crotch. And I'm thinking, well, I mean, why doesn't anyone, Dr. Small, just look at that and say, it's a dude? I mean, right? It's just, this is a dude.
Well, I'm reminded through this entire conversation, I can't help but get the child's book, The Emperor's New Clothes, out of my head. And everyone knows this story about the emperor who was so vain that he needed to have the finest garments known. And so a charlatan came into town and convinced the emperor that he was the finest seamstress and finest cloth maker in the world, and he spun all these wonderful cloths. But in fact, these were non-existent. But the servants and population of the emperor were so afraid of the emperor and knew of his vanity that they continued to espouse at how wonderful the emperor looked. And slowly over time, the charlatan convinced the emperor that he was wearing the finest manufactured clothes in the world, which were absolutely nothing, right? And then the emperor wants to parade and goes down through the city on a horseback in the finest clothes that could ever be manufactured, and the population is applauding, knowing full well what the emperor was actually wearing. And the small child points out, look, Mommy, the emperor has no clothes. And the emperor, for that one moment,
look, Mommy, the emperor's an empress. Yeah.
realizes that it's all fake, it's all false. And this whole concept of, a man can be a woman, well, that's first of all foolishness. It cannot be. You can identify, I guess, as a rock if you want to.
But you're an OBGYN. Have you ever seen a man that somehow became a woman?
No, and that's foolishness. And that goes against the very foundations on which we exist in humanity. But this idea of someone competing as something else is something that has to be decided as a society. And I think that's where we're finding ourselves when we have all this crossover, because people are trying to say this is science. Well, it's foolish. It's not science. This is just personal opinion. And that's where the difference between that scientific...
Don't question science, doctor. Come on, don't question science.
Okay, I'll just be quiet from now.
You can't question science.
I'll stop talking.
Even though that's the name of this podcast, you can't question it because,
No.
This is a dude.
Or question the fact, is it even science? That's right. I mean, is this even science? Because, that's the whole point. What is science? Science is asking a question and doing an investigation to determine the answer to that question. And I guarantee you, if they did an investigation, is this guy a woman, they would find out he was not.
Imagine that. So in a statement this past April, National Collegiate Athletic Association, the NCAA, announced its unequivocal support for the transgender community and expressed no misgivings about the prospect of biological men outcompeting women in their given sport. Quote, the NCAA Board of Governors firmly and unequivocally supports the opportunity for transgender student athletes to compete in college sports. The commitment is grounded on our values of inclusion and fair competition, the NCAA said. Talk about questioning the science.
Well, the NCAA fought for so many years to get women's sports into the system, right?
Yes.
And now they're watering it down. And under the auspices of this absolutely non-scientific, there's no question here, because there's no question that exists. It is not something that's rational. And no matter how you slice this bread, you're still going to have bread. And the point is here, you've got two opposite concerns. We're talking about politics entering into science, and now we've got science entering under the guise of politics, and that somehow this is scientific, that this guy wants to be a female, and therefore he can take some testosterone suppressing medication and somehow turn himself into a female and compete, when he's just going to have natural ability that's going to be superior to the average female. They were horse racing. Remember the horse racing the other day? They were worried about that Kentucky Derby winner getting steroids, and they finally found out that it was cream and not a shot of steroids that the horse was getting, and the horse keeled over and died of a heart attack.
Oh, I thought it was a COVID shot.
It could have been. They're probably giving COVID shots now. They're giving them to zoo animals. I don't know. They're giving them to horses now.
So next up, podcast listeners, we have the dumbest bill in America. And do we have a loot up, Mr. Producer? Here it is. Dum 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 dum. And it's the dumbest bill in America, and it is Oregon's permanent mask mandate. Permanent, podcast listeners. A mask mandate that is permanent. We have a clip, but before we play the clip, we have to play, or at least read this to you. This is in the Daily Mail. Oregon is set to enforce permanent mask mandates for indoor public spaces as COVID cases continue to rise. So Oregon sparked panic when its health authority announced it was planning to make its mask mandate permanent for indoor public spaces. The state's health authority's rules advisory committee met with business leaders, faith leaders, and stakeholders on Thursday to discuss the worryingly worded draft of the next new mandate, which will be released in a week. And Dr. Paul Cieslak of the Oregon Health Authority said the permanent mandate is indefinite, as it can be repealed any time by the state. So it's an indefinite mandate, but it's really a permanent mandate. At least that's what Dr. Paul Cieslak said. By the way, podcast listeners, just so you know, Oregon is one of those states that never lifted the mandate for indoors. They've had a continuous mask mandate indoors since the beginning of the pandemic. Now they want it permanent or indefinite. We have a clip, and here's that same doctor from the Oregon Department of Health, Dr. Cieslak, talking, and he's being interviewed, and you can hear it in his own words. We have that clip, and here it is.
That might scare a lot of people. They might think, oh my gosh, are we going to be masking for forever? What does a permanent ruling do? Why not just extend the temporary rule?
Permanent means indefinitely. It doesn't necessarily mean permanent. We could repeal it as well. But we are only allowed to have a temporary rule for 180 days. And if anything that goes beyond 180 days, we cannot extend it temporarily. It's either, adopt it formally or let it go.
I know.
So this is the dumbest bill in America. Oregon's permanent mask mandate, which is indefinite. I don't even know what he just said. Can I tell podcast listeners, we have to play this again, because this is the guy who's the top guy in the health department in the state of Oregon.
Scientist.
He's a scientist who apparently follows the science. We have that clip again. You got to listen to it again. Here it is.
That might scare a lot of people. They might think, oh my gosh, are we going to be masking for forever? What does a permanent ruling do? Why not just extend the temporary rule?
Permanent means indefinitely. It doesn't necessarily mean permanent. We could repeal it as well. But we are only allowed to have a temporary rule for 180 days. And if anything that goes beyond 180 days, we cannot extend it temporarily. It's either, adopt it formally or let it go.
I'm sorry. I can't help myself. I can't make this stuff up. I mean, this is what a blue state looks like in modern America during a pandemic, and this is what it looks like.
Well, this is a classic example of politics and science, because this is purely political, because you could change the law, right?
Yes.
But they're accepting the law as it is to make this thing permanent, because that's what he feels he's restricted to. You notice there's no mention of science. There's zero mention of the logic of being masked indoors. There's no science, no studies quoted, nothing related. This is purely politics. And even then, it doesn't make any sense.
No, but it doesn't make any sense. But he said, well, it's an indefinite one, but we have to renew it in 180 days, but it's permanent, but still indefinite. And I mean, I've never heard science talk like that in circles before. A scientist talking in circles like that before. And I think this is what's so
You've
maddening.
heard of Fauci, haven't you?
I've heard, that's right. I am science. Luke, I am your father. I am Dr. Fauci.
We don't need masks. Oh, no, we do need masks. That's a circle.
It is a circle. It's circular speaking and here's my thing. And again, we have Dr. Small here with us. Dr. Small, why is it that it's one size fits all during the pandemic? That's really one of my takeaways during this pandemic. We have a pandemic and everybody's going to have the exact same treatment. There's going to be equity in treatment. It's I don't want equity in treatment. I want the treatment that's best for each individual, because not everybody needs the same treatment.
I have 4-letter word for you. You ready?
Yeah.
Easy. It's easy. It's easy to make it mandatory for everybody. It's easy to make something universal, okay? Even if the science goes against it, it's easy. And therefore, that's the thing we're going to do, because then it's universal, right? Everybody likes those terms. And all of this is based on, what is easy. Okay?
It's whatever I guess makes it so that they don't have to put extra work on themselves. But I thought that doctors regularly kept up with journals that they read, medical journals and so forth, and they would read those and then bring that in.
Oh, absolutely. No, you're supposed to do that, but that's difficult and that takes time and that's challenging. And that's what I said earlier. Science requires work. It requires effort. It requires thought. It requires.
But they're doing what's easy because that's their job, I guess. And being a health commissioner, you just want to one size fits all. I want to not work any harder than I have to. And I don't want to be blamed for anyone dying. But in my opinion, more people are dying because of what they were doing, because you don't have the ability to individualize care.
Well, that goes back to what we discussed last time, which is autonomy, right? The individual's right to look at their own health care versus this blatant overreach of politics.
Well, and that's the last word. I want to thank you, Dr. Jim Small.
Time flies, doesn't it?
It sure does. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to Dr. Jim Small for joining us. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.